Math rock is best known for its unusual time signatures, fast syncopated riffs, and the use of guitar tapping and loop pedals to create additional density and complexity. But Palm is no ordinary math rock band. On their highly conceptual 2018 album Rock Island, they push the rhythmic complexity of this genre to its absolute limit, with more advanced rhythmic techniques such as metric modulation, call and response phrasing, tempo changes, ambiguous downbeats, and of course, extensive use of good old polymeters and polyrhythms. Some of you might be surprised to learn that the terms polymeter and polyrhythm are not, in fact, interchangeable. To illustrate, let's take a listen to Palm's song Bread, which makes separate use of both of these techniques along with quite a few others. The song starts with a sort of soundscape that eventually coalesces into two chords before it launches into its first section. There's a ton of tricky rhythms here, but let's talk about the section's harmony real quick first. We're in the key of C major, and the guitar's chords are mostly voiced as diatonic major sevenths or major sixths. Not quite jazz chords, but certainly more lush than the basic triads. Of course, there are a few chromatic elements in this section, such as the opening movement from the C minor 7 to the C major 7, but they seem to embody psychedelic pop playfulness more so than jazz sophistication. The next four chords repeat a 1 major to 4 major movement, though the latter two have a voicing that's closer to the chord's relative minor sevenths, A minor 7 and D minor 7, and it's the bass guitar that enforces the original two root notes. Also, over this last F major 6th chord, the vocal melody, which up until this point has been pretty straightforward, sustains a B natural, what amounts to a sharp 11 extension. This produces a bit of tension since it forms a tritone with the F. It even gives this chord a taste of the 5 dominant 7 flavor, which you'd expect to resolve back to the 1 major chord. But instead, the progression pivots to a non-diatonic B-flat major 6th, and then alternates back and forth between this chord and a C major 7. This borrowed B-flat is only slightly darker than the original key, and the major qualities of these two chords ensure this section has a bright, mellow sound that's common to most Palm songs. One Bandcamp patron described these as surreal, beachy tunes, which I think hits the nail on the head. But here, a queasy feeling underlies this aesthetic, due to the chromatic movements between the B-flat and B natural, as well as the vocal melody's unconventional chromatic contour. The C major 7th chords are also accompanied by the 5th in the bass, which has a sort of unstable sound, though it also helps to make the transition from the ending C major 7th to the opening C major 7th sound less static as the section repeats. All in all, the chords themselves are not that unusual. What makes them really strange is their rhythm, with each guitar playing these chords with a very different timing. One simply repeats dotted quarter notes, in other words 3/8 notes, which fits neatly into the 6/4 meter that the chord changes and vocal phrasing also follow. In contrast, the other guitar holds these chords for 5/8 notes. This repeated unit goes over the first bar line, but as we approach the second bar line, it truncates to 4/8 notes instead, resynchronizing with the other guitar as they change to the next chord. The bass guitar follows this rhythmic pattern as well, substituting 2 quarter notes for this final half note. This is essentially a truncated 5/3 polymeter. It might be more accurate on some level to notate the guitar and bass in a 5/8 time signature, with every fifth measure truncated to 4/8. But in practice, the whole pattern is short enough, and the polymeter is simple enough to make an overarching 6/4 meter more convenient to read. The drum part, on the other hand, is not quite so simple. Though the opening snare hits prime us to hear a more evenly spaced rhythm, the snare quickly comes to follow a more unusual pattern. A 5 quarter note length phrase, comprising 5 hits, that ignores the usual 6/4 bar lines. It's a bit subtle, as the positions of these doubled snare hits tend to emphasize the same 3/8 length rhythmic positions within each repetition, but as the pattern repeats, it begins to shift out of line. And what's more, while the 5/8 guitar pattern truncates every second measure, the snare pattern continues untruncated for a long time. After 2 measures, hi-hat and bass drum are added to the mix. The bass drum plays dotted 8th notes, similar to the first guitar, but the hi-hat interlocks with the 5/4 snare pattern, filling in its 8th note gaps. 12 measures go by before there's any variation in this pattern. at which point its first 4/8 notes, a doubled hat and doubled snare, are replaced with single hits, though this does not break the 5/4 duration of this pattern. It's only after 14 measures that the pattern truncates. Following this, the 5/4 pattern resumes, but now there's only 2 measures left in the section, so it needs to truncate a second time. So, this section actually has 2 distinct 5/3 polymeters, with one being short and regular and the other being long and irregular. There's also one other little quirk in how the hi-hat and snare interact. At first, it seems like the hi-hat is just filling out the snare pattern in a sort of linear drumming style. But closer scrutiny reveals that the hi-hat pattern is actually the same as the snare pattern, just shifted over by 5/8 notes. Another way to conceptualize this is that the pattern's first half, lasting 5/8 notes, is the same as its second half, just with the hi-hat and snare reversed, kind of like a 5/8 version of a paradiddle. This kind of rhythmic tessellation is hard to pick up on if you're not looking for it. Anyway, after the A section repeats twice, most of the instruments drop out, leaving the guitar to repeat this new motif at length, a single 5/8 measure cycling between a few diatonic chords. I notated the motif so that this beat is the one, which matches how the A section leads into it, as well as the phrasing of these perfunctory bass and drum parts. However, when all the instruments join in earnest, the location of the downbeat becomes rather uncertain. Eventually, it becomes apparent that it's really here on the last 8th note, and this is how I decided to notate the next stage of the B section. In a way, the long incessant repetition of this measure, a technique that Palm uses in other songs as well, helps to blur the boundaries between these two interpretations. Of course, there's an even more disorienting rhythmic feature in this new stage. The bass and drums begin to play 8 equally spaced divisions over the course of the 5/8 measure. This is essentially an 8/5 polyrhythm. Now, as far as I can tell, the terms polymeter and polyrhythm don't have strict academic definitions, but most musicians I know seem to observe what I find to be a rather helpful dichotomy between the two. To see what makes Bread's B section a polyrhythm as opposed to a polymeter, let's compare it to the A section's guitar parts. In some sense, both of these sections use 2 different simultaneous meters. In the A section, these 2 meters, 5/8 and 3/8, share a common 8th note subdivision. Consequently, the 5/8 meter lasts longer than the 3/8 meter, and if you repeat them both, they quickly fall out of sync, only realigning after 3 repetitions of 5/8 and 5 repetitions of 3/8. In contrast, the B section forces its 2 constituent meters, 5/8 and, 8/8, to last the same amount of time. This means that every measure is synchronized the same way, with each of the meters sharing their first beat, but it also means that these meters' 8th notes have different durations. The contrast in subdivision timing between these 2 parts is much more jarring. They're essentially playing at different tempos. Despite this, Palm manages to make these meters sound more lined up than they actually are. In particular, the 3rd guitar chord seems to coincide with the 2nd snare hit. On paper, these 2 features shouldn't actually line up. The guitar chord is 3/5 of the way through the measure, or 60%, whereas the snare is 5/8 of the way through the measure, or 62.5%. But at the 140 BPM tempo this section is played at, this corresponds to a difference of only 0.05 of a second, which is too small for most people to notice. If you line up the 2nd guitar chord and this bass drum hit in a similar way, you can see that both meters divide the measure with a short, long pattern. In the 5/8 meter, this is 1, 2, and 2/8 notes, whereas the 8/8 meter makes it 2, 3, and 3/8 notes. This re-quantization of metric divisions is actually an established technique, though the different interpretations are often used sequentially, not overlapping. Prog metal drummer and YouTube music theorist Yogev Gabay has a great video on this subject that I'll put a link to in the description. So, this is all very mathematically interesting, but at this point Bread's selection of time signatures and subdivisions might be starting to seem like an arbitrary grab bag of numbers. However, there's actually an interesting correspondence between the song's first 2 sections. If we look at a full repetition of the A section's truncated polymeter, we can see that the guitar playing in 3/8 has 8 total chords, whereas the guitar playing in 5/8 has 5 total chords. Of course, these 5 chords are not quite equally spaced, with the final one lasting only 4/8 notes, so this is not a true 8/5 pattern. But suppose we were to take this rhythm and speed it up so that the guitar's dotted 8th note is as fast as the 8th note of the B section's drum pattern. This is nearly 5 times the original speed, at which point the discrepancy between these 5/8 and this 4/8 is much harder to catch. And in fact, the position of the first realignment of this polymeter corresponds with the alignment of the third guitar chord and second snare hit in this polyrhythm. So, in a purely theoretical sense, maybe this isn't actually a polyrhythm, it's just a super fast version of the A section's truncated polymeter. Of course, in practice it would be basically impossible to perform it as such, so the polyrhythmic interpretation is still more or less valid. Nonetheless, this kind of devilish complexity is characteristic of Palm's approach to rhythm on Rock Island. There's also a slight variation in this section's rhythmic pattern that leads up to a transitional motif. The measure changes to 7/8, which the drums fill out with non-polyrhythmic dotted eighth note hits. And then the motif itself consists of 8 hits. As far as I can tell, these hits don't fit into the grid of a single tempo. Rather, they follow an accelerando whose speed begins at a half note at the B section's tempo and ends at a quarter note. Since these first and last hits are aligned with the tempo, it allows this motif to integrate itself smoothly into the section overall. And then, after running through this whole section a second time, this motif helps disguise a change in tempo as it transitions to the C section, which is at 125 BPM. Much like the A section, the C section uses a 6/4 time signature, with the drums implementing a 5/4 polymeter. However, this time, only the snare drum is polymetric, as the hi-hat reverts to a simple quarter note pattern. The guitar and bass are playing a new, simpler pattern as well. The chords here are a C major 7 and an F major 7. The one of the guitars throws in a cheeky E flat over the latter chord, acting sort of like a chromatic leading tone back to the C major 7's E natural as the riff repeats. There's also a clear repeated 3/8 structure to this riff, with the guitars playing on the first 2 eighth notes and the bass guitar filling in the 3rd eighth note. And then suddenly, at the end of this riff, we get a single measure of 13/8, essentially an extra eighth note tacked onto the usual 6/4 meter. This odd measure leads into a new riff, and you could kind of think of it as a way of transforming the higher second eighth note of the guitar pattern into the new downbeat. And indeed, in the second half of the C section, we can see that one of the guitars continues the 3/8 feel of this higher note. There's quite a few rhythmic tricks here, but let's look at the harmony real quick first. There's an F major 6th and then a B flat 6/9 before landing on a more ambiguous chord. There, the bass on one of the guitars seem to sustain the B flat 6, but now there's also an E added in the second guitar and the vocals. And towards the end, the bass and the first guitar also incorporate a C. This sort of suggests a C9 chord, which gives the whole pattern a classic 1-4-5 progression, albeit in the key of F major and with the 5 function left somewhat sketchy. Additionally, in the second repetition, the bass guitar plays a D underneath the initial F major 6th, forming more of a D minor 7th, though this is still a very normal diatonic chord. Several of the instruments here continue the bouncy 3/8 pattern of the previous riff. The second guitar hits the first eighth note, the backing vocals hit the second eighth note, and at first the drums fill in the third eighth note with rim shots. But these are contrasted by the first guitar playing quarter notes, which play a cycle of 4 chord voicings, alternating between high and low. This is once again a polymeter between 3/8 and 4/4, though these meters are short enough that it's convenient to embed them within a 6/4 time signature, 2 measures of which happens to be the length of the polymeter's full repetition. But then a random 3/4 measure is inserted, which disrupts the pattern. This is followed by another 2 6/4 measures, but here the first guitar's quarter notes revert to a more normal 3/4 pattern. At best, you might be able to think of these quarter notes and the second guitar's dotted quarter notes as forming a basic 3-on-2 polyrhythm, though this is a pretty common syncopation in even normal rock music. The drums follow suit, with the hi-hat and snare playing a 3/4 note pattern and the bass drum playing dotted quarter notes. On the second repetition, the drums briefly go back to the 5/8 polymeter that's used in the first half of the C section, and in fact the bass joins in on this with 5/8 note timings that harken to the A section. But then everything falls back in line with 3/4 for a moment before the song returns to the B section. The transition into this new B section is marked by a sudden increase in tempo to around 155 BPM. The triplet snare fill at the end of the C section seems to foreshadow this change, though it doesn't seem to line up with the new tempo's 8th note with an obvious enough ratio for me to consider it a metric modulation or anything. Regardless of the change in tempo, we still get a familiar 5/8 guitar part, though this time the drums and bass are in 5 as well. If there were any lingering doubts about where this section's 1 is, then this final variation should clear things up. Its hi-hat frames the drum pattern with deliberate sounding half notes, and the bass riff has a 3/3/4 structure that's very common to the 5/4 time signature. These patterns play out at length, letting the drums improvise a bit underneath, and eventually they begin to incorporate that 8/5 polyrhythm from the first B section, though only for a couple measures at a time before reverting to the normal 5/4 groove. And as with the original B section, there are also a few transitional motifs interspersed throughout, though the second one does not play in a cello-rondo, instead performing all 8 hits as dotted 8th notes. After continuing in this vein for a while, the B section closes with one final transitional motif, which serves as an emphatic end to Bread. Despite the puzzle-like quality of some of this track's rhythms, Palm does an excellent job of applying them in service of a cohesive sense of style. They may be ambiguous or even a little disconcerting, but when combined with a veneer of warm psych-pop instrumentation, they end up closer resembling the pleasantly random motion of ocean waves. Ultimately, just like the rest of Rock Island, Bread really captures the vibe of a sunny day spent dropping acid on the beach. This concludes my analysis of Bread. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain.